We are in our Obon season. I know last weekend was Sacramento's Obon. I regret not being able to attend it because it's the same weekend as our Obon festival. And ours takes 2 weekends where we have the Obon service on one weekend, and the following weekend we have the festival. We kind of combine our bazaar and our Bon Odori into one. So that was last weekend. So I'd like to share with you 2 weeks ago at our Obon service, I had a young person from our temple give a talk at what is called the Hatsubon service. So Hatsubon is a special service for families who lost a loved one over this past year, since last year's Obon. So at our Hatsubon service on the altar we have the Buddhist name card and a candle of all those loved ones who passed away during the past year, and the families attend and we read the names of those loved ones. And so it's all families who just lost a loved one during this past year. And so I had a young person, his name is Jeff Onuma, share the talk that he gave here a little over a year ago at the youth retreat that was held here. The youth retreat is called YAC Youth Advocacy Committee, and it was held here for many years. This year's retreat was held at the Jodo Shinshu Center in Berkeley. So 2 young people from our temple came to the retreat here a year ago, and Jeff gave this talk that I'd like to share with you. So all the young people have to give a talk during this retreat. And I was just astounded by the talk that Jeff gave. He talked about his late grandmother, and this is the story that Jeff shared. Jeff was very close to his grandmother, and she did a lot with the family, and I believe lived very close by. Very unfortunately, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer when he was in high school. She was told by the doctors that she maybe only had 2 months to live. But she had a very deep will to live, and she lived 2 years after her diagnosis of cancer. She was determined she wanted to live long enough to see her eldest grandchild, Jeff, graduate from high school. And that was really what was keeping her going. Unfortunately, she passed away before his high school graduation. But from the time of her diagnosis until her passing, she realized she would not be able to be with her family for many milestones in their lives, especially her grandchildren's lives. So she began to compose letters to her grandchildren that she wanted them to read at those milestones of their life. So she composed a letter for Jeff that she wanted him to read at his high school graduation. She composed a letter for Jeff to read at his college graduation. She composed a letter for Jeff to read on his wedding day someday. She composed a letter for Jeff to read someday when his first child was born. So all of these letters, in those final 2 years of her life, she was composing for her grandchildren and children and family members. And they put them in the family safe so that they could be read at that milestone when it occurred. Well, sometime after Jeff's grandmother passed away, he came home from school and his mother was in tears standing outside of the house in the yard, and a police car was there. Their home was broken into, and their family safe was stolen. You know, they could take money, jewelry, any material thing, but the letters that she had written for her grandchildren and family members, the letters were gone. The letters were gone. And it was such a sad thing for Jeff and all the members of the family. We'll never be able to read those letters that Grandma wrote to me. So initially, he was, of course, very, very upset and very angry and very sad. But then, over time, and I think perhaps because of his exposure and nurturing in Buddhism, he came to accept the fact that the letters were gone. And I think he came to realize that, well, deep down, he knew what his grandmother probably said in those letters. She would have extended her deep love and, for her family, and that was something that he knew he didn't need to read a letter to know. He already knew that in his heart and mind. And then he also shared this image of how he resolved the passing of his grandmother. He says, well, you know, when a person passes away, it's like a drop of water, an individual drop of water that falls into a pond. So the individual life of this drop of water is gone, but it becomes one with something greater. A pond, an ocean, a lake. And when this drop of water drops into the pond, it sends ripples out on the surface of the pond. And he felt that his grandmother's life was like that. That she had influenced himself and members of his family and other relatives and friends, and her life had a rippling effect that was reaching out far beyond her own individual life. And I thought that was a very beautiful way of understanding, not only even resolving, but coming to sense his grandmother in a different form. In a different form. In the world of truth, the world of the heart. Sacramento Buddha, before he passed away, his disciples were all gathered around him. And they were in deep sadness and sorrow. How can we live on without our beloved master? And the Buddha said to them, those of you who think this physical body is the true Buddha, you are greatly mistaken. The true Buddha lies in the heart of my teachings, what I have shared, the truth of the Dharma. That's the true Buddha. That's what you must come to know in your heart and mind. And with those words, he passed into nirvana. So I think Jeff too came to know the real essence, the real heart of his grandmother, something beyond life and death, something beyond her physical form, that he realizes it will, that true essence will always be with him. I've shared this before at some other discussions, but I'd like to share with you a passage from one of my favorite books. This is written by the Vietnamese master Thich Nhat Hanh. Maybe some of you have read books by him. This is a book titled No Death, No Fear. And in this book, Thich Nhat Hanh shares what he went through when he lost his own mother. And maybe during this Obon season, some of you may be thinking and reflecting on your own late mothers. So let me just share with you this passage from this book. The day my mother died, I wrote in my journal, a serious misfortune of my life has arrived. I suffered for more than 1 year after the passing away of my mother. But one night in the highlands of Vietnam, I was sleeping in the hut in my hermitage. I dreamed of my mother. I saw myself sitting with her, and we were having a wonderful talk. She looked young and beautiful, her hair flowing down. It was so pleasant to sit there and talk to her as if she had never died. When I woke up, it was about 2 in the morning, and I felt very strongly that I had never lost my mother. The impression that my mother was still with me was very clear. I understood then that the idea of having lost my mother was just an idea. It was obvious in that moment that my mother is always alive in me. I opened the door and went outside. The entire hillside was bathed in moonlight. It was a hill covered with tea plants, and my hut was set behind the temple halfway up. Walking slowly in the moonlight through the rows of tea plants, I noticed my mother was still with me. She was the moonlight caressing me as she had done so often, very tender, very sweet, wonderful. Each time my feet touched the earth, I knew my mother was there with me. I knew this body was not mine alone, but a living continuation of my mother and my father and my grandparents and great-grandparents, of all my ancestors. These feet that I saw as my feet were actually our feet. Together, my mother and I were leaving footprints in the damp soil. From that moment on, the idea that I had lost my mother no longer existed. All I had to do was look at the palm of my hand, feel the breeze on my face, or the earth under my feet, to remember that my mother is always with me, available at any time. So Thich Nhat Hanh, like anyone, experienced great sadness after the loss of his mother. But in time, he began to sense his mother in other forms, in the moonlight, in the tea plants. And he sensed that his mother and father and all of his ancestors, his totality of life, they're all, in a sense, with him as he lives his life. So at our own time, this is how we reflect on the loved ones in our past and how they continue to be a part of our life, of great influence, great guidance, great teaching. We can remember our loved ones from even 50 years ago as if we're seeing them just yesterday. And like Jeff, I hope that when we lose a loved one, a dear loved one, although we go through a period of grief and sorrow, that I hope that we can come to resolve the loss. Not only resolve it, but find that our loved one is there deep within our hearts and minds. In Shin Buddhism, our loved ones are with us in the truth of Nam Mô Mi Dabut Su. Nam Mô Mi Dabut Su, for those who might be here for the first time, sounds like a foreign word, but it's the essence of the truth of enlightenment, wisdom and compassion, expressed in a single word. Expressed in a single word. So when we say Nam Mô Mi Dabut Su, we are bowing our heads to the truth of enlightenment, the truth of great wisdom and compassion, the heart of the Buddha, the heart of the Buddha. And our loved ones, when they pass on, they become one with that world of truth, the world of Nam Mô Mi Dabut Su. Nam Mô Mi Dabut Su, 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 Nam Mô Mi Dabut Su.